As I was working on creating this channel, a couple of weeks before I released my first video, I gave a presentation to a small crowd at a film photography workshop that two friends of mine and I put on in Springfield. I'd been putting a lot of energy into figuring out how to make videos and record audio, but I wasn't quite there yet. Concurrently, we were working hard on the workshop to hopefully give people some value for attending. I recorded each of us speaking so we could hear how we all sounded and have a record of what we did. I never intended on making my presentation public. Not because I was embarrassed by it or anything, but it was a personal story that was intended to be shared in person with a small crowd rather than to be posted online. Because this wasn't intended to be released publicly, I really wasn't worried about the quality of the video. I exposed for the screen that the images were going to be projected on, not myself speaking, so I'm in shadow except for when I happen to walk into the projector's light. I used a wireless mic to record the audio into my R5 as it recorded the video. I scripted my presentation, and because I wasn't able to commit it to memory, I read it off my phone. There were certain beats within the story I wanted to tell that I wanted to make sure I hit. I wanted parts of the story to echo other parts until I got to the finish line. The workshop was called 35mm Love, and I spoke last out of the three of us, and then we all went and played with some film cameras. I was nervous leading up to sharing this story, but was ultimately happy with how it was received. If you make it to the end, I hope you enjoy this story as well.
So you got me. So it is on, and you are ready to go.
All
I
right.
give you.
Hi, everybody. I have some notes because there are some things I wanted to make sure that I said. Oh, that's the wrong way. Now I know which is next. So first I want to thank everybody for coming. This is really great. I had an opportunity to meet some of you before, but not everybody. So definitely come on over and say hi if I haven't met you already. Also want to thank Chris for opening his studio to all of us today, and for Dave for some great info. Also Karen, who's doing some behind the scenes, worked with her many times. Let's see. So film, for me, film is, it's more personal. And for me, film has been part of a journey that I've been on. And for me to talk about that, I have to talk about where I came from. So I'm going to be referring to this a lot. So I'm a wedding, portrait, and commercial photographer, and I'm currently in my 34th year of making images professionally. Started in 1990, and that's when I consider myself starting as being a professional. But there wasn't any commercially available digital photography, so it was all film. So I was a student at UMass. That's me. I had hair. I was at a photography concentration in the art department, and I was working as a photographer for the Collegian, which was the student newspaper. As sometimes happens on college campuses, there was a protest, and one happened to be near my dorm as I was coming home from the Collegian. And so I had my Nikon 6006, which you can see right there. And so I photographed what was going on, and eventually the group went and took over one of the administration buildings, and I was the only photographer there that I knew of. Went back to the Collegian to start developing the film because I knew they were going to want this the next day. And the Springfield Union News, which was what the Republican was called at the time, they were doing an article on it, and they had no art to accompany the text. So they reached out to the Collegian to see if anybody from campus had any photos. And I was in the newsroom at the time. I raised my hand and said, I do. So they asked me to bring the negatives to their office the next morning, which I did. And by that time, the Associated Press had picked up on the story. And it was them that ended up buying my photo for a grand total of $50. So when you're 20 years old in college, that's awesome. Bought some pizza and beer. Well, I was 20, so maybe not so much with beer. But I got my Associated Press photo credit from that one. And it's that point from which I consider my professional career to have begun. So these days, if anybody knows me or my work, it tends to be for images more like this. This. And this. So I'm super fortunate to be able to make my living as a photographer. And the switch to digital in the mid-2000s helped make the economics of it more feasible. Dave touched on that because film costs some money. But I never lost the nostalgia for shooting film. So after UMass, what I was then photographing was news for small local papers and a number of local bands and nationally touring bands. I did that for a number of years, and I'll show you a few of those. So that's Moby, That was shot on film. That's Tori Amos, Beck, the Go-Go's, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And there were many more, but those were the first ones that came to mind when I was collecting photos for my presentation. But it was a fun world to be in. But eventually, I did it for a number of years, and I started to get disenchanted with it. The editors that I delivered the photos to were really happy with the photos I was delivering. I was proud of them, to be sure, but there wasn't a challenge in it anymore for me. And I was still shooting news largely for Mass Live at that point. And that, seeing news, it's not always nice, you may have noticed. And that started to affect me in ways that I didn't think was healthy for me. And I love photojournalism. And, I thought it was noble and creative. And honestly, I had pretensions of being in the same profession as James Bockway and Lindsay Addario, if you know who those photographers are. But being here in Western Mass, I never saw anything close to the kinds of things they were witness to, thankfully. But locally, car accidents and locations where shootings happened and some of the regular city goings on were enough for me, so I stopped. The last news event I photographed was a Central High School graduation. It was at Symphony Hall, and I was there for Mass Live at the time. And this graduation was noteworthy because one of the seniors, an honor student athlete, had been shot and killed earlier that year. A posthumous diploma was going to be given to his parents, and all the photographers there were lined up to get that shot of his mother being handed the diploma. And the moment came, and like any event where something's happening on a stage, everyone's going to get more or less the same shot. And I remember thinking, what else is there to the story? What else is important here? And that diploma was certainly a celebration, and it was a memorial to that student. And it was certainly important, but I wanted to know what else was there to this moment? And, I and the other photographers, we were lined up along the outer aisles with our long lenses, and I was at the end of the front row, and the student's family was seated front row center. And when the diploma was being given, everyone's focusing on the stage, and I turned in the direction of the family, and the student's father, he put his head in his hands, and he just started to cry. And I don't know if anybody else captured that moment, but I submitted it to Mass Live, and it ran both there and in the Republican. And I remember when I was pressing the shutter, I felt both. This is that story. This is that other aspect. And it shows how it affects the family. It makes it personal. And at the same time, I felt this is a real intrusion. And that was it for me. That was actually the last news story I ever photographed. I just didn't want to see that kind of thing again. I didn't want to feel that way again. But I never lost my respect for photojournalism. And I still believe in its power to be noble. And, the photographers to be witnesses to life's events and share their vision with the rest of us. But it wasn't for me anymore. And around that time, I was also spending more on film and developing as a freelancer than I was making photographing news and bands. So because of those economics, I wound it all down. So I want to full disclosure, full transparency here. I wasn't making a living as a photographer at the time. All my photography was freelance. I did this while holding down a full-time job as a graphic designer and product photographer for a marketing company. That's what paid the bills, and it subsidized my photography habit. Because of that, I was able to take a step back and really reevaluate my relationship with photography. Now, my timelines overlap a bit here. This isn't a strictly linear story. So it was a couple of decades ago, so I'm doing a lot of this by memory. Professionally, I'd gone digital at this point. First I got a Canon 10D, if you remember that. Then I got a 30D, skip the 20. And then the 5D, which was phenomenal. I even got to use, prior to that, I got to use a Kodak DCS 520. Do you remember the Kodak DCS 520? It was an EOS 1 retrofitted with a digital camera back. And actually, this was taken with that. It was the first professional DSLR I ever used. So this was probably late 90s, 2 megapixels. I actually reprocessed this just the other day. And just as a quick aside, I know we're talking about film, but it's amazing that some of these old digital captures, how much you can eke out of them using modern Lightroom and having years more of experience having used it. Lost my place. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So during that time, when I was reevaluating my relationship to photography, I thought, what can I do? What can I shoot that I haven't done or shot before? And I wanted something new to challenge myself. And for me, that answer was not 35 millimeter film, but medium format film. I'd only used 35 millimeter at that point, and prospect of a larger negative, a new way of shooting, it really appealed to me. And there were camera shops selling used Hasselblads and Bronicas, and they were pretty expensive. And I didn't want to invest that much in it, not knowing if I'd even like it. So I went on eBay and found to Bill was saying, eBay is a great place to find some of this old stuff. And I got this. It's a Lomo Lubitel 166, and even got one with the Russian rating on it, which I thought was really cool. It is a Russian plastic camera. I think I paid $25 for it on eBay. So I was getting my feet wet with 120 film. So I bought my first roll of 120 film. I ran it through that, and I learned how to use it. And it was fully manual, which I hadn't had that experience before. All of my cameras had some kind of automatic function on it. And I never used a manual camera fully before then. And, having to slow down, and Chris had touched on this earlier, really having to slow down, really consider your exposure, really consider your composition. It was fun again for me. And there was no pressure to make images for anyone other than myself. No one was going to see these photos unless I made a print. And this was all still before social media, except maybe LiveJournal or MySpace, but I wasn't on any of those. But this thing, that was fun. But it had I forget who said it, but there were a lot of light leaks in this camera, and it can't keep the film flat, on the film plane. So there were lots of out of focus areas on the negative. And I understand that's part of the charm, but I wanted to, up my game with it a little bit and do something a little more professional looking. So I looked around, and I loved the twin lens reflex aspect of it. And so I got that. Yeah, that's just beautiful. I love these things. And so that was a 2.8C. If you're fans of Rollies. And I became such a fan of Rolly, I named my cat Rolly. So, if you follow me on Facebook, you'll see lots of pictures of him. So if you ever wondered, that's why I named him Rolly. So I went on walks with this thing, and it just photographed whatever caught my eye, and eventually my family and my friends, and actually a friend's wedding. I actually shot a wedding on that before I was doing it professionally. And this all brings me back to the overlapping timelines. So back in the day, speaking of weddings, I had no interest in photographing weddings, like at all. In the 90s, wedding photography, it was kind of looked down on. It wasn't anything like it is now. It's very creative now, and it seems like everybody that has a camera at some point gets asked to photograph a wedding. And it's definitely not for everybody, but I was just, it just wasn't for me. At the time, the stereotypical wedding photographer, was a guy who would get drunk and hit on the bridesmaids, and sadly, that was sometimes true. And the wedding photos from that era, they were all staged, they were all posed, and it just wasn't me. Every wedding was pretty much the same. It was the same contrived moments. It was the same poses. It was pictures of the dad's bride pulling, his pockets out and showing doesn't have any money left. And, it was what it was, but, it wasn't for me until a friend of mine said, Seth, we know you don't photograph weddings, but we really like your photos, and we promise not to hate you if the pictures stink if you photograph ours. And I didn't have the traditional background wedding photographers had at the time, which was largely portrait-based. So I photographed it the only way I knew how, which was as a photojournalist, as a story and an event to be covered. And to my surprise, it was more creatively satisfying than I thought it would be. And in contrast to news, everybody was happy. It was fun. I did it for the cost of the film and the developing and some prints, and I remained friends with the couple, so I guess I did a good enough job. And I thought, I could do this again. So it was around this time I discovered the Digital Wedding Forum, which I don't know if it's still around, but at the time it was really important to me. It became a resource for wedding photography in the early days of digital. And commercial digital photography was still in its infancy then. There was no Lightroom. This was before Lightroom. There was no workflow to speak of. And getting prints and making albums was laborious, and it was expensive. I don't know if you had this experience back in the day shooting digital. Did anybody shoot digital back then when it first started and before Lightroom? Yeah, I'm that old. But this forum was fantastic because it had I had photographers from all over the world, and they were contributing their knowledge and their expertise, and everyone was just sharing how to get through this new wild west of digital imaging. And I found there were a number of photojournalists transitioning to photographing weddings as stories to be told instead of just using people as props. And I did a couple more weddings, both on film and digital, and saved up to attend the main photographic workshops, which is now the main media workshops. And I attended a week-long immersive section. It was called Digital Event Photography. So if you've had the fortune to have a really life-changing experience, this was one of them for me. I came home for that workshop knowing I needed to do this full time. And on the drive home, I came up with a plan to do so. And the next week, I hired an attorney, I hired an accountant, and they set up and structured a business for me. And I gave myself 3 years to go full time. And 2.5 years later, I'd grown the business to a point where I was both too busy with that and hold down a full-time job. So fortunately, I was making more from the wedding photography than it was at the day job. So I gave my notice in 2005, and here I am. So digital had come a long way, and it wasn't too long where the speed and capabilities surpassed film for commercial work. An infrastructure developed around it, and the barriers for workflow and delivery had been overcome. And we're all used to it now. But if you're of a certain age, you might remember that and how far it's come. And I really do marvel at it still. And I don't think I'd touched a film camera for years. The Rolleiflex sat on a shelf. It looked good, and it was a conversation piece, but that was the extent of it. And then we had a little pandemic. Maybe you remember. Now, how wedding photography fared as a field during that time, that's another story. But it's fair to say I wasn't as busy for a couple of years. And I still had a lot of film not stored properly at all, if I'm being honest. And I thought, look, I wanted to play with this again. So I loaded up the Rolleiflex. And it really felt good to hold that camera again after holding, DSLRs for years at that point. And it just felt right. I got excited and I brought it outside and I shot half a roll and the camera seized up and wouldn't fire anymore. But I really wanted to use that thing. So I was able to get the film out of it and have it developed. But I wanted to wanting to use that camera, I looked into getting it repaired. And I quickly found out the repairs would cost more than the camera was even worth. So I went on eBay to see what was available. Again, back to eBay. So for the cost of repair, I found options for older cameras. But to get those older cameras in working order, I'd have to send those out to be cleaned and have make sure the gears were lubed properly and all that stuff that you deal with vintage cameras. So I thought, if I was going to spend that much anyway, let's see what the next level of budget can get me. And, this went on and on. So, well, if I spend this much, and then if I spend this much. And so I ended up buying that. So this is my current camera that I'm working with. And once I had this in my hand, the film bug bit me hard. I've since picked up a handful of other cameras that are fun to use, different formats and they each have different characteristics, and using each one makes me feel a unique way and different about what I'm shooting, depending on the subject. Now, my wedding and commercial work stays digital. The workflow, speed, quality, it's what my clients expect, and I'm perfectly content to stay there. But film's for me. I brought a couple of film cameras to weddings over the past couple of years, both 35 millimeter and 120. And it's fun, but honestly, I think I appreciate it more than my clients do. And also adds an economic element with the cost of the film and the processing, and that eats into the business side of things. So I haven't done much of that this past year. That's until a good friend, a different friend from earlier in the story, got married last summer, and I was more than happy to be a guest. I hear living on a prayer every wedding, and I would get to dance to it this time. But knowing I was into film for its own sake rather than anything commercial, they did ask me to make a few film portraits of them outside of what the official photographer was going to be doing. Now, if you're in the wedding world at all, there's no do-overs. You either capture it or you missed it. And with digital, you can look at that little screen and know, or at least have some kind of idea whether or not you got it. And that's not the case with film, which you'd mentioned earlier, I think. So I brought 3 cameras with me. Let's see. There you go, a little baby brownie. It takes 127 film. Let's see, Rollei 35S that takes 35 millimeter film, and the other aforementioned Rolleiflex 2.8 GX, which takes 120 film. And because I could put a flash trigger on that, and this guy right here, I brought a couple of Godox 8200s for portraits. And I used the other cameras for the ceremony. Let me see, which button do I press? There you go, for the ceremony. So this was with the Rollei 35S, and that was Lomo Metropolis film, I think. And I think I actually pushed it because it was a little dark on that one, so that's why it's kind of grainy there. But I like the look. The Metropolis, it's a little browner. I was playing around with it. Just went to see what I could see. And I did this for my seat, and I had respect for the hired photographer. So if you ever go to a wedding, don't jump up and start taking photos because the photographers hate that. Right, Ron?
How many rolls of film do you have to take with you?
For this, I shot not a lot because it does add an economic element to things. So if I'm going to be doing something specifically for film, I'll incorporate that into the price structure of how I'm going to charge people. But I did, I like memory cards or batteries. You bring more than you think you're going to need, just in case, because you don't want to run out of anything. So I didn't shoot a lot for this because they did have an official photographer to do other stuff. But I was going to be doing some film portraits specifically, so I had some ideas on what I was going to do. And in fact, that's a good segue. Thank you. So I discussed in advance with my friends who in the middle there, and the photographer they hired when I would take them for their film session. And I'm no stranger to wedding timelines, so I did them fairly quickly, but came up with a plan beforehand. I walked the grounds to see where I was going to do them, so when the time came, we could just go right there. I have an app on my phone called Sunseeker, which is fantastic. Yep, and you can point it wherever, and the camera will show you your environment, and it overlays where the sun's going to be at any particular time. So if it's noon and you think you're going to be at 4 o'clock, you can hold it up and the sun's going to be there at 4. So that can be super helpful for a wedding photographer, any portrait photographers. Let's see. But one of my regular assistants, Karen, hi, she was there too. So she was a guest too. So she volunteered kindly to help me move my lights and measure distances. And so with my film cameras, the ones I have, the Rollei and the 35S and the Rolleiflex, I can't focus with my eyes on these things. They're just, for whatever, I don't know if I have old eyes or what, but it's just a struggle I have. So I measure it manually. I actually bring a tape measure with me and I measure from the subject to the film plane, and then I put on the focusing knob. It'll tell you the distance, and I put it in there. So that's called zone focusing. That's called zone focusing, right? Yeah. So that's how I focus with my those old manual cameras. Actually, I don't think they came out half bad. There was this one. There's this one. This was on the Baby Brownie. There's actually one in the back right there. I think this was made in the 1920s. There's no controls on it whatsoever. There's just a little button and you hit it. You can't control the aperture. You can't control the shutter speed. You can't control focus. It just is what it is. It's purely point and shoot. When they come out, I think they just have this great quality. The film was Rollei Crossbird 400, but it was 127 film, and you can still get that. I get it off B&H. I don't know if you sell that 127 film. To my surprise, you develop it. So it's certainly not a very common film, but it's if you're going to use one of those old vintage cameras, that's what you got to do. And then that right there, that was with the Rolleiflex, and that was Kodak Gold 200. But I also used my lighting with that. And Karen there helped me measure the distance for that. So she took my tape measure, brought it over, and we figured out how I was going to focus it. So I'm kind of happy with that, and they were happy with that. And so that's my metric for how if I did a good job or not, whether or not the client is happy. And shooting film at this wedding, that was my full circle moment for me, and I'm grateful to them for that. So why is film relevant to me? So for me, digital cameras, they're how I work, and it's how work gets done. It's what I reach for. Digital is what I reach for when someone hires me. But if I'm going to be photographing something more personal, I want to make something that speaks to my feelings or my state of mind. I tend to grab for a film camera. Chris had touched on that earlier, doing stuff just for you. It's film. And for me, it's the same way. So I see you. Yeah. Last fall, I had some personal upheaval in my life, and things hadn't gone, as expected in a particular aspect. And after the obligatory feeling sorry for myself stage, I needed to examine it in some way. And if you're anything like me, I know a lot of creative people are like this, that personal loss makes you want to make something. And I know people who paint or draw or write, and I make photographs. And I hadn't done this in a while, things had otherwise been going well in my life. My commercial work was satisfying, weddings were great. And I hit an emotional wall at that point. And it was a film camera that I reached for to channel those feelings into. So one day, shortly after all of that, loaded up the Rolleiflex. I got in my car, I Googled walking trails near me, and I picked the first hit in Google, and I headed out. I shot one roll during that walk and two more when I went back the next day. Now, to be honest with you, walking outside isn't something that I typically do, but it wasn't so well. Moving around is kind of new to me. And I've actually kind of kept it up. And I keep the camera at home now because those walks got expensive. But having that camera with me, it really helped me transition from sad, sedentary Seth to less sad, less sedentary self. So why is film relevant to me? It's art, it's therapy. It's art therapy. Reconnecting with those analog tools, they help me get through a rough time. And if you want to see some of those samples, here's a few. Wrong button. There we go. So this was late December, early January. It was cold out. No one else was around. And it struck me that I'm here in a public space with no people. And I thought, that was as good a metaphor as any for how I was feeling. On the second day of those walks, as I was finishing up, walking to my car, wondering what I'd put on the last frame of the last roll, I saw this. And I thought to myself, things are going to be okay. And I thought that was a good way to end that walk. It was a good way to finish that roll of film. It's a good way to finish my talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my story. If you like what you saw, please like and subscribe. Those likes really do help with the YouTube algorithm. Do you have an art therapy story of your own? If so, feel free to leave it in the comments below. If you'd like to see more videos with more stories, check out this other one I made for you. This is Ask a Wedding Photographer. I'm Seth K, and I'm here to help.